they told you they're recording.
Recording in progress.
Now go. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back in. We got a really nice presentation, the hype around cannabis. And this is very interesting to me because there is a lot of hype. And there's truth in the hype, and sometimes there isn't truth in the hype. And so I'd like to hear what our presenters have to say today. I got into the cannabis realm through physical therapy. I'm a physical therapist. I also teach at university. And the client that I remember really opening my eyes to this, she had a child with epilepsy. And she went from having 12 seizures a day to one mild one to none, with using higher concentration CBD and those types of things. And so that just opened my eyes to it, got me into it, and then Jeff and I started talking about this about 4 or 5 years ago, and then educating healthcare providers. So that's how I got into this world, into this space, and I'm just glad to be here today. I want to introduce our first speaker. I read about Josiah, read about his book, read about how he got into it, and I'm gonna let you talk a little bit about that as we go. And online we have Dr. Martha Rosenthal. She was actually one of my teachers in the area of cannabis, so I'm glad to see her and listen to what she has to say. She's received a number of teaching awards for what she does. She educates in the use of drugs, drug addiction. Also, hello Martha, say wave to everybody. There she is. And so very, very cool to see her again. And also Amanda Barton, and she's in cannabis law and in those areas and having that, so I'll be interested to hear what she has to say too. So without further ado, Josiah, the mic is yours.
Hey everybody. Is this the presentation remote? Gotcha. A little bit new to this technology, so you guys will have to bear with me. This is a story I've told a lot, but not in a multimedia capacity, so maybe a bumpy ride. So I'm a journalist from Denver, Colorado, write for publications like Vice and The Guardian and Esquire. But I came from a small town in Iowa, a small working class town. And this is sort of the story about not only the work that I've done as a journalist, covering the intersection of cannabis and sports, but really how cannabis played a role in my transformation as somebody who never exercised at all, never really cared for exercise or physical movement, to ultimately running marathons and ultramarathons. So when I first came to Denver, wait, how do we do this? Screen button? The other green one. Yes. So when I first came to Denver in 2004, we were just on the cusp of changing our cannabis laws. And I was working as an arts and entertainment reporter for various local publications like the Denver Post and Colorado Public Radio, and was having a little hard time advancing in my career or getting pitches accepted from larger publications. But when legalization finally hit Denver in 2012, after a number of reforms, medically, decriminalization, when we really became the first state to legalize recreationally. I know Washington did at the same time, but they got started much later than us. There was a real opportunity for me as a journalist to cover this topic. Most journalists at the time were very established in their careers. They came from middle upper class backgrounds. They didn't really want to have anything to do with this topic. But I came from a working class background. I was an arts and entertainment reporter. I knew a lot about this, and I didn't have the reputation to protect that they did. So this was something that I could jump into, and it gave me a platform to write for big international publications because there was a whole spotlight on Denver. So at this time, when I was doing this kind of reporting, I was not living a terribly healthy lifestyle. I was chain smoking cigarettes, I was drinking a lot, I was getting into hard drugs, a lot of the typical vices that young male writers fall prey to. And like I said, exercise was never in my wheelhouse whatsoever. But this was going to be a video. I think we had some problems transferring it. But suddenly I could do these videos for The Guardian or Vice, where I would go on camera consuming marijuana. My mother was very proud. And it gave me access to a lot of the new products, a lot of the new technology that a legal system afforded, and particularly edibles. And before this, edibles were kind of a wild west. Nobody really knew how potent they were going to be, and they were certainly not consistent or reliable. But now suddenly we could have these products that you knew you were taking 10 milligrams of THC because that's what it said on the package, and we had a whole marijuana enforcement division that was making sure that this was the case. And when I was living this kind of hard hedonistic lifestyle, I was having a lot of mental health issues, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety that would be typical for somebody who's consuming these substances and not moving their bodies, and also not eating terribly healthy. So I thought I would give running a try. I hated it. I thought it was painful, it was boring, it reminded me of jocks that kicked my butt in high school. I know we're recording, I don't want to curse. So I didn't really care all that much for it. But then I remembered this documentary about Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 1970s, Pumping Iron. At the end of it, there's a famous scene where Arnold Schwarzenegger takes a hit of a joint, and I started learning that a lot of bodybuilders were using cannabis, and so I thought I'd give it a try with edibles, give running a try. And it was a game-changing experience. I felt lighter, I felt happier, I felt more in tune with my body. It was something that was so pleasurable it became the centerpiece of my day. And so I started entering some races around Denver, started running some ultra marathons eventually, but this was mostly in the city. And it was when I met this guy, Avery Collins, an ultra marathon runner, that I started to learn how popular cannabis was in the ultramarathon running world, which in itself is huge in Colorado. Boulder is kind of the center of the ultramarathon running world. And he was telling me that around 80-90% of ultramarathon runners are using cannabis before, during, or after their training or competition. A lot of them don't in competition. Avery likes to stress that because that's banned, as it is in all sports. But seeing the popularity of that, it first got me into running trails, which was a game changer. You know, being in nature, there's the term forest bathing that's become very popular. It's shown to have as a significant impact on mental health as antidepressants, just spending some time in nature. So you combine cannabis with running in nature, and you get a pretty heady elixir that can really have a huge impact on mental health issues. So this became the centerpiece of my day and my life, to such the extent that I bought this van, outfitted it with a bed, and started traveling around the country, running in different places. This is me at sand dunes in Iowa. A lot of these were going to be videos, but they're still Austin, Texas, Moab, the Everglades. This is me in Malta. Recently, Switzerland. Wow, yeah, tech problems. And it was such a fascinating thing for me that I wanted to start writing about it. And so I did some articles for The Guardian and Esquire. This headline was something that I didn't choose. That's a whole nother story. Some senior editor wanted to turn it into a kind of hysterical piece about addiction, when really I was talking about that I was addicted to the experience of running high and not the traditional nefarious use of that term. But then I met this woman, Angela Bryan, which some of you may be familiar with. She's done a lot of research out of CU Boulder around the intersection of running and cannabis. But she actually started as a behavioral anthropologist that was concerned about the amount of exercise Americans were getting, which, as we can all guess, is profoundly low. According to the CDC, about 23% of Americans get sufficient strength and cardio exercise. And Angela was actually concerned that the legalization of marijuana in Colorado would exacerbate this problem. So she started doing some research into this. She did some surveys in legalized states looking at people who used cannabis and what their exercise behavior was. And to her surprise, she found that 80% of respondents said that they were using cannabis before, during, or after their workouts. So this was kind of a game changer in her research to the point that she started using cannabis herself. She actually had major surgery and didn't take any opioid medication afterward. She stuck with edibles, and she was curious as to why these people were using cannabis while they were exercising. And so she did this research at the sports lab in CU that I participated in, where we run on a treadmill sober, and then 2 weeks later we consume cannabis and run on the treadmill again. They had us wear these elastic waistbands tied to the treadmill, as if people under the influence of cannabis are like drunken toddlers that are just going to fall on their ass. The research around this, the study is going to be published sometime next year, but she was looking at your level of dissociation, your level of pleasure, your level of engagement when you're running under the influence. And for me, and a lot of the people that I spoke with, it just completely changes your perception of exercise. There's a lot to get into when it comes to pain or recovery, but the mental aspects of exercise was something that I found terribly fascinating, and Angela Bryan did. And I wanted to dig in a little further into that. So I reached out to this guy, Raphael Mechoulam, who some of you may be familiar with. He's kind of known as the godfather of cannabis science. He educated me on the endocannabinoid system and all of its different functions, but particularly one endocannabinoid called anandamide. Comes from the Sanskrit word for bliss. And this is something that's released in our bodies that is responsible for what we know as the runner's high. It's a reduction in pain, an uplift in mood, engagement with nature, engagement with the present moment. It's something that people outside of cannabis have been talking about for 40, 50 years, since the big running boom of the 70s. But it's something that's been a little elusive and difficult to define, and has been erroneously associated with endorphins. And that is changing, and Raphael Mechoulam was really a game changer for my perception of what was going on in my body in that experience. And I wanted to also look into where it came from. The University of Arizona did some fascinating research around anandamide levels with people who are exercising. There's a famous study that was in the book Born to Run that looked at the evolutionary influence over running, how it shaped our bodies, how humans are really the best distance runners of the natural world. We aren't the fastest runners. We can't outrun a cheetah, and we can't outrun a gazelle over short distances. But what we did learn to do over a long period of time was to wear down gazelles with a kind of slow trotting run, especially in the heat, which made them easier to attack and kill after, we basically exhaust them. And this is something that we all engage in when we run a marathon, and it's something that also gives us an uplift in mood, the runner's high. So around this research, they took 3 different species. They took ferrets, dogs, and humans and had them run on a treadmill for a certain period of time, and then tested their anandamide levels afterwards. And predictably, the ferrets had no increase in anandamide. These are sedentary creatures. They mostly sleep 13 hours a day. But also predictably, dogs and humans had a huge surge of anandamide after this very specific realm of 20 to 30 minutes of running at about 70% max heart rate. So you can go too fast and miss it, or you can go too slow or for too short of a time and also miss it. So there's a lot of distance runners will talk about how the first mile or two is usually terrible, and then things just start changing after a certain period of time. Well, this is what's going on. So we're not only born to run in the physiological sense, but on an emotional, psychological level, we have this mechanism in us that rewards us for running certain distances at a moderate heart rate. And at the same time that I was doing this research, a whole host of professional athletes, mostly retired professional athletes, were coming out of the cannabis closet, so to say. And most of them were putting these numbers at around 60 to 80% of their peers were using cannabis before, during, or after training, or often in competition. So all these things were happening at the same time for me. I was writing a couple of articles on this, but it wasn't really in my wheelhouse. I was doing some science reporting, but sports was not anywhere near my career field. As a freelancer, I can jump from topic to topic and covered almost everything imaginable except sports. So I was very hesitant to jump into this. But all of these things were happening at the same time, these scientific developments, these athletes in large numbers saying that they've been using cannabis for a long time. My experiences going from completely sedentary, completely unhealthy, to running ultramarathons in the mountains. It was just too much for me to ignore as a journalist. And so I started spending a lot of time with other professional athletes. This also is going to be a video. This guy, Andre College, he lost his legs in an accident, was having incredible neuropathic pain, discovered with cannabis that he could engage with his body not only without physical pain, but without the psychological barriers that losing his legs had left him with. And he started not only engaging in these races that no other wheelchair athlete could do, these very rugged ultramarathon races, but he started traveling the world, going from the lowest point in every continent to the highest point. So doing an incredible amount of climbing, an incredible amount of biking, and really just blowing everyone away with what he was capable with as a para-athlete. And then there was this guy, Brent Connell, Iraq War veteran, who was having severe PTSD, couldn't function in life. He moved to the mountains. He started running with cannabis, and not only was he engaging in ultramarathons, but he found that he could sort of process a lot of the overwhelming trauma that he had experienced in combat in those moments. There was something about running in nature under the influence of cannabis that allowed his mind to deal with things that otherwise would have been overwhelming. And he also goes running with goats and dogs, and that was the other way that he stays in the present moment. I met this guy, Jerry Dunn, who was running a lot of ultramarathons in the 70s and 80s and setting all kinds of records. He was secretly using cannabis that whole time. Here he is with Jimmy Carter. And so I really was just overwhelmed with all of these stories and felt that if no one else was going to write this book, it might as well be me. So I wrote Runner's High, and the reception of it was quite extraordinary, and I'll get into the various media aspects of that in a moment, but the tagline that we came up with for this book is "Pot makes exercise fun," which, not crazy about the term pot, but it was something simple and lyrical that got the point across. Mainly that this plant has the power to transform our psychological and physiological relationship with exercise. That people who previously hated working out can find pleasure in it. And when something's pleasurable, you do it more often and you do it more vigorously. And the media reception was overwhelming. I was on ABC News, New York Times did a piece on it, Wall Street Journal, and High Times. This headline I chose because it was strange that they were so focused on the recovery aspect of this book, as a lot of people were. And I don't want to downplay that, but it was something that wasn't, I touched on in the book, but it wasn't at the center of it at all. But when the book came out, this had happened just about 2 months beforehand. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what happened to Sha'Carri Richardson. She was a star athlete and was at the Olympics, and her career was on the rise, and she was caught with THC in her system, knocked her out of competition, and then this happened shortly after the book came out. There's been some interesting developments with Brittany Griner recently. I can get into that in a minute. But suddenly I found myself asked this question again and again and again. Is cannabis a performance-enhancing drug? Well, there's so much to unpack there. It would take a whole nother presentation to really get into why WADA considers cannabis a banned drug. They say it's performance-enhancing, they say it's detrimental to your health, and they have this third criteria for banning a substance, and that's it violates the spirit of the sport. And as you can see in this quote, they don't really have all of that solid a definition of this. This isn't anything that they have any kind of metric that they can apply to the question of whether something should be banned or not. But there's a lot of, in my opinion, kind of hokey terms like fun and joy and fair play and honesty. I mean, it's something I roll my eyes at, partly because nobody's really arguing against any of these things. There's no counterpoint. You know, we want unethical sports. We want unhealthy sports. We want them without courage or community. But then they really start to nail down what it is they're getting at later on in this paper that they released, saying the role model of athletes in modern society is intrinsically incompatible with use or abuse of cannabis. Use of illicit drugs are harmful to health and may have performance-enhancing properties. It is not consistent with the athlete as a role model for young people around the world. And as somebody who grew up in the era of Nancy Reagan, the war on drugs, this is very familiar rhetoric. This isn't anything that can be applied as a metric to any given situation, really. You're basically just saying, you know, I think Jeff Sessions, the former Attorney General, characterized all of this best when he said, good people do not use marijuana. That's really what they're getting down to with this spirit of the sport rhetoric. And this is something that I never really felt like I had the chops or the sports journalism background to weigh in on outside of this kind of war on drugs rhetoric. For me, it's something that is really not applicable to what I was getting at with the book Runner's High. For me, I'm fascinated by the pleasure of exercise, the pleasure, in my case, of running, but it applies to all kinds of activities. It's something that isn't just a laborious chore that people need to get through, but something that can actually be quite pleasureful, regardless of whether or not it's good for your health or makes you physically attractive or impresses other people or gives you a career in sports. And I don't want to put down any of those things. But when you engage with it from the perspective of playfulness, of joy, of being in the moment, it can give you something that I think makes it a part of your life, suddenly a part of your day. And I don't really have all that much to say about whether or not it gives you an unfair competitive advantage in the realm of sports. WADA is reconsidering their ban on cannabis. There should be an announcement sometime this year. They're currently reevaluating it, so we may see some huge pendulum shift, and that could, you know, go as far as players being endorsed by cannabis companies or sports games or sports arenas being endorsed by cannabis companies. In Denver, we have Coors Field, you know, a stadium that's basically owned by an alcohol company. It's really not inconceivable that cannabis could play that role sometime in the future. But for me personally, I'm going to continue using cannabis as something that enhances my life and makes me enjoy exercise and enjoy my body in a way that I previously found impossible. So thank you very much. I think we're going to have a Q&A after the three of us speak.
There we go. Well, thank you, Josiah. And he's right. We're going to save time at the end for good audience interaction and such. So if you've got questions or comments that you want to do, you know, write them down like I was doing as you were speaking. Brought up a number of thoughts as we went through there. Our next guest, Dr. Martha Rosenthal, is joining us virtually online from her home. And we'll have her up on screen. Yeah, hello.
Hello.
There she is. All right. So, again, as I said before, Dr. Rosenthal is a professor at Florida Gulf Coast University currently, or at least last I saw, and teaches in this realm. And she provided me with some excellent education a couple of years ago in an intensive course series. And so I'm going to turn it over to her and let her talk about what she does and her topic.
Well, thank you very much. Let me share my screen and I'll dive right in. Share screen. Okay, and hold on. Start. All right, can you see the screen? I don't know if can you see it or not yet?
Can't see it yet, Dr.
No,
Rosenthal.
not yet? Okay.
There we go.
Hold on, let's try again.
There we go. Can we
Yeah,
do
you
with
see
the
it now?
volume, guys? With the volume?
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
I can't hear anybody.
Yep, we're good. You're on.
You can see it. Excellent. Okay, so let me dive in. And I'm Martha Rosenthal. I am a professor at Florida Gulf Coast University. And I teach neuroscience, physiology, human sexuality, drugs and society, and I lead our cannabis classes. So sex, drugs, brains, and bodies. I have the best job in the world. I write books. This is my latest textbook. It's about drugs. I make educational games. So my latest one is about how to be a cannaboss. I lead, FGCU has CREW, the Cannabis Research, Education, and Workforce Initiative. We have 9 undergraduate courses about cannabis. Let's see, I'm vice chair of the Consortium for Medical Marijuana Clinical Outcomes Research. And this, I just want to give a shout out to FGCU Cannabis Professional Certificate Program. This is an online 5-week multidisciplinary program, all things cannabis. So we cover the plant, cultivation, extraction, physiology, pharmacology, medicinal uses. We talk about cannabis law, business, taxes, history. We talk about how to critically evaluate information. We talk about how to make edibles. And Jeff and Jim have both been through this program. Amanda Barton, our next presenter, is one of our experts presenting. Barry Gordon, another expert, will be presenting for us this year. So if you're curious about this program, this 5-week program, all online, you can just Google FGCU Cannabis Professional Certificate Program or shoot me an email at martha@fgcu.edu. So, all right, let's just dive right in. Medical cannabis. Medical cannabis is effective. You know, it's often used to treat pain and muscle spasms. It's very good for MS and muscle spasms, anxiety and depression, insomnia, and many other conditions. It's also safe. You know, cannabis has one of the highest therapeutic indexes of all drugs. There's no known fatal overdoses. So it is both safe and effective, but there's still pushback against its use. So why is that? Why do we still see this pushback? So what I want to start talking about are the difficulties why we have these difficulties in accepting medical cannabis. And the main reason for this, I believe, is that medical use of cannabis, it doesn't conform to a lot of the standards of traditional Western medicine. So the CSA is the Controlled Substances Act. And for a drug to be approved by the CSA, it requires that the drug meets several requirements to be accepted as medical treatment. So CSA requires that a drug's chemistry has to be identified and reproducible. There has to be adequate studies to prove that the drug is both safe and effective. The drug has to be accepted by qualified experts. And there has to be scientific evidence for the drug. The scientific evidence has to be widely available. And unfortunately, medical cannabis doesn't fit well with all these criteria. Even though we may know it's safe and effective, it doesn't fit well with these criteria. So I'm going to take these one by one and talk about these and where the problems come from. So first, the drug's chemistry has to be identified and reproducible. And this is because clinical trials, they have to be performed using the exact medicine that would be used by patients. And that's so you can have the standards of good manufacturing practices. The one who is manufacturing the drug can show that they must consistently produce a product of known and repeatable composition. This is a problem. There's no definitive standard of what medical marijuana actually is. You know, different chemovars have very different amounts of THC or CBD or different ratios, different doses. Different chemovars are very different. And not only that, the same chemovar can be different You go in to get your purple herbal or whatever one day, and the next week it might be different. And so it is not easily reproducible because it's a plant, it's whole plant. And whole plants have, this whole plant especially has hundreds of physiologically active substances, and it may vary from plant to plant. And whole plant consumption is, I believe, in many ways better, but the truth is it's just not as consistent and replicable as standard pharmaceuticals. So that is some pushback right there. Some other reasons I think we see some pushback. You have to have adequate studies to prove that the drug is both safe and effective. And I first want to say there's a ton of research. Not only do we have a lot of anecdotal, but there's a lot of clinical research. Last year, there was almost 4,000 scientific articles published about cannabis. So there's a lot coming out, but there's still challenges with this. So some of the challenges in gathering this data. Who's going to perform the studies? Typically, it's the pharmaceutical company that made the drug. And these studies can cost tens of millions of dollars, if not more. And what pharmaceutical company is going to want to do that? Because marijuana really it's not patentable. It's not patentable as a new, unique product. It's a plant. And so how will they recoup their expenses in performing these these studies? So that's going to be one pushback there. Another is, as Josephine was saying and railing against rightly, why it's still a Schedule I drug. And there is actually a federal appropriations rider that prohibits federal funds from supporting any activity that promotes the legalization of any drug basically included in Schedule I. So that is a problem, and it leads to a catch-22. Because the catch-22 here is that the federal government claims that cannabis is a Schedule I drug because there's not enough research supporting its efficacy and safety. But at the same time, they're limiting the research because it's a Schedule I drug. So how do you work around that? It's really putting a barrier to the acceptance of medical cannabis. All right, there's a lot of barriers coming. Another pushback, another barrier is the acceptance of the one drug, one target approach. Now, in the past, most medicines came from whole plants, but things changed about 200 years ago. In 1805, morphine was isolated from opium, and that transformed pharmacology. All of a sudden, they're going to get the active ingredient, and coca was isolated from cocaine. Coca is relatively safe. Cocaine is not. Salicylic acid was isolated from willow bark. So we started isolating the active ingredient, and it caused a shift towards plant isolates and then the synthetic compounds that come from those isolates. And this led to a paradigm shift that we've been experiencing for the last couple hundred years. The idea that one drug affects one target that causes one disease. And I'll talk about this later, but it's so much more complex than that. But we are kind of locked into this whole magic pill, this magic bullet idea that one pill with one substance can solve everything. And cannabis, with its 140 different phytocannabinoids and terpenes and flavonoids, doesn't fit this model we've been living under for a couple hundred years. All right, a couple more roadblocks. The drug must be accepted by qualified experts, and scientific evidence must be widely available. So let's talk about what a typical prescription for a traditional medicine, it's going to be something like take 20 milligrams of fluoxetine once a day by mouth in the morning. Cannabis, first of all, it can't be a prescription. It's a recommendation. So a cannabis recommendation might be, I recommend that you inhale, ingest, or drop under your tongue some amount of an unregulated, inconsistent substance on no specific schedule at your choosing. Okay, you can understand maybe why a lot of physicians have some pushback against that, because that is not the traditional way we prescribe other drugs. I think some other pushback from some physicians is the lack of education. and we've talked about this as well, there's a lack of education and understanding about the endocannabinoid system. A study that came out 5 years ago, 2017, only 9% of medical schools had content on medical cannabis. 9%. They don't talk about the endocannabinoid system, which is the most widespread system of metabotropic receptors throughout the body. And most med schools don't even mention it. That same survey of residents and medical residents and fellows, 89.5% felt not at all prepared to recommend medical cannabis. And only 7.5% said that they felt prepared to even answer any questions of their patients against medical cannabis. So that's a lot of the pushback as well, is that if you don't understand it, you haven't learned about it, you might not feel ready to recommend this very helpful substance. Finally, pushback. The complexity and individuality of the endocannabinoid system. Endocannabinoid system is ubiquitous and it is complex. It is throughout your body. It doesn't just control one small thing. We say it controls relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect. It's a widespread system throughout the body. And everyone's endocannabinoid system is different. And so this means that cannabis therapeutics is personalized medicine. It's not one pill fits all. There's not one ratio, not one product that's going to work for every body, for every disease. But I think this is a feature, not a flaw. I think the use of medical cannabis may revolutionize the way we practice Western medicine. So let me get in and talk about this exciting part, how we really can change things with cannabis. So how cannabis may revolutionize the practice of Western medicine. All right, I was in the shower one day thinking cannabis thoughts like you do, and I was shaking my fist to the cannabis gods, just thinking, why is cannabis so complex? No other drug is that complex. And I was like, Martha, yeah, they are. So you start to think about the other drugs, we pretend they're simple, and they're not. So somebody also mentioned alcohol. We pretend that alcohol is simple. I was like, yeah, okay, it's a very simple molecule. We don't understand alcohol. We don't fully understand how it works. It has effects on the plasma membrane, GABA, glutamate, opioids, dopamine, all sorts of things. Its effects are going to be different based on your race, your sex, your age, the time of day you drink, how's your liver function, what's your mood, what's the environment. It is not simple. We want to pretend it is, it isn't. Cocaine. So I actually got my master's studying cocaine. A fairly simple molecule, but it's different in everybody. Some of you who are my age or older may remember Len Bias. Len Bias was a very promising basketball player, and the first time he did cocaine, he dropped dead. And some people are cardiosensitive to it, and they will die the first time they do it. We don't really understand this yet. Again, so simple, fairly simple molecule, not simple, different in every body. One more, Valium. Valium, half-life in the elderly can be 10 days long, not in younger people. So all these drugs, we want to pretend that other drugs are simple. It's just cannabis is just so complex. But maybe cannabis can help us remember that medicine is not one size fits all. Every body is different. And so let's remember that and treat the patient, treat the individual as an individual, and remember these complex individual effects. Another way cannabis may help change the way we practice medicine. The body is complex, and there are not simple answers. We want there to be some simple answer, and we highlight it and memorize it and then blankly skip down the street, then thinking we understand it all. But it's just not how the way the body works. So just as two examples, depression. I got my Ph.D. actually studying depression and REM sleep and their relationship. We want to pretend depression is due to low serotonin, and here's your magic Prozac pill that raises serotonin. There, you're fixed. And most people are not fixed. Antidepressant, the SSRIs, are no more effective than placebo for mild to moderate depression in 2/3 to 75% of people with depression. Depression is not due to low serotonin in most people. There's no evidence that people with depression have low serotonin. It takes weeks to work. I could go on. It's a whole other talk. Depression is multifactorial. It's genetic. It's environmental. It's psychology. It's how's your hippocampus? The neurogenesis in the hippocampus plays a role. There's so many things. It's not simple. It's not just serotonin, as much as we want to pretend it is. Another example, weight loss. Weight loss is calories in equals calories out. No, it's not. We've known it isn't for 70 years, but we still try to pretend it is. The body doesn't have calorie receptors. The body doesn't speak calorie, it speaks hormone. So weight loss, again, is a complex relationship with your age, your sex, your hormones, when you eat, all sorts of things. And we want to pretend it's simple, but it is not, because the body is complex. And this complexity is beautiful. And I think we have to embrace the complexity and enjoy it. So cannabis can help us remember that cannabis is complex, but it all is. That's not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing. So may help us remember that cannabis, the body, all these things are complex, and not to pretend it's simple and look for just a simple treatment. All right, another way cannabis may revolutionize things. Hopefully it will help us to remember to honor the patient, not the pill. Americans love pills. We love, first of all, I do want to know what this pill is. And I kind of want it because she's having entirely too much fun with whatever that pill is. But we love pills. We give them to our patients, and here's 325 milligrams. It will do this. And if it doesn't do this to you, what's wrong with you? Oh, you grew a hand out of your forehead. Well, here's another pill to solve that. Oh, that one made your feet turn blue. Oh, here's another pill. We address it like the pill, the medicine is correct. It didn't work how it's supposed to in your body. What's wrong with you? And another thing I often say in my drug classes is a headache is not a sign that your body is low on aspirin. Listen to your body. It's not just honor the patient, not the pill. What is going on with your body? The pill isn't just the answer. And cannabis may be already decreasing our use of some pills. We do see this. A lot of people on medical cannabis have reduced or discontinued their use of opioids, anxiolytics, NSAIDs, antidepressants, and others. And this is just one chart from my recent paper talking about users of cannabis and prescriptions for opioids. Now, correlation is not causation, but I do believe there are many people who get on medical cannabis and because of that are able to get off their opioids, their benzos, which are more dangerous drugs. They have a much lower therapeutic index. They're more addictive. So I do see cannabis pushing us away from some of these more dangerous pills. All right, back with honor the patient, not the pill. When I first started really studying medical cannabis, the dosing thing bothered me. Years ago, the dosing thing bothered me. So, we say start low, go slow. And at the time, years ago, I was like, oh, what's up with that? No, 325 milligrams, that's the answer. And I've done a 180. Start low, go slow. Because what that means is, how do you feel? There's no right answer. It doesn't matter what your doctor says you should feel or what your friend said you should feel or what anyone says it should be. How is it for you? How do you feel? And pay attention to that. We encourage patients to keep a journal of how much they took, how do they feel. Pay attention to themselves and trust themselves, not the pill. And so this type of dosing that we say with cannabis really could change our relationship with drugs and with our own bodies and our minds. This may help us to focus inward rather than outward. Our attention is largely externally focused. What I mean by this is, it's 12 o'clock, it's time to eat. Not, are you hungry? But not how do you feel, but, it's time to do this. And have you ever, eaten dinner in front of the TV and not even noticed that what you were eating? Because it's external focused attention. And that's largely the prefrontal cortex taking care of that. But if we could switch more to an internally oriented attention, which is something we can see with start low, go slow. How do you feel? Pay attention to your body. An internally oriented attention, different parts of the brain fire up with that. That's the insula, posterior cingulate gyrus. And posterior cingulate gyrus, that's what's active during meditation. And actually, meditation, some forms of meditation, are at least as effective for depression as antidepressants are. So being focused inwardly may actually be part of the cure for depression. So I think it's really important for us to learn to pay attention to our bodies, ourselves, and not just, what am I supposed to feel? All right, some other things is cannabis may change. Acceptance of whole plant medicine. All right, as I said, for 200 years, we've been in this whole one target, one drug, one disease approach, that there's one thing that's gonna fix it, one drug. Cannabis doesn't work that way. And chronic conditions often have multiple underlying causes. There's not one simple fix. It's depression. Let's go back to depression. It's not just one chemical. It's your mood. Did you get divorced? What's your environment? What's your health? It's multiple things. And cannabis can fit better with this. It is complex. What are we up to? 140 different phytocannabinoids, and they all interact. There's that beautiful ensemble effect. And then you get the terpenes and you get the flavonoids, and it's very complex interaction. So it doesn't fit with a one drug, one target approach, but most diseases are not that simple. So appreciating the ensemble effect and the complexity may help us better treat some of these diseases that are multifactorial. Cannabis may also be part of our increasing acceptance of psychedelic drugs, and this excites me. There's some real cool things happening lately. Psilocybin. Psilocybin's exciting. Psilocybin from magic mushrooms that is showing some remarkable effects, to help with depression, anxiety, end of life adjustment. And experimental psilocybin-based treatment was just fast-tracked by the FDA in 2018 as a breakthrough treatment for depression, because it's looking to be so much better than anything we already have. It's currently in phase 2 clinical trials, so that's exciting. MDMA, we used to call it ecstasy, currently called Molly, but MDMA is showing amazing success in treating PTSD. It is way better than anything we currently have. And that is in phase 3 clinical trials. Ketamine, esketamine, has been approved since 2019 for treatment of some severe depression that isn't treatable by our other antidepressant drugs. And again, correlation is not causation. I'm not saying cannabis caused the acceptance of these. I think they all kind of go together. I think we're having a different view of these drugs and how their success, we're more accepting of these psychedelic drugs than we were in the past. Finally, I hope that cannabis can help us remember to critically evaluate the information. So you can't just take things at face value. If you are a patient yourself, if you're a healthcare provider, if you're an educator, you can't just, it's not like, take your Xanax. No, you have to really read and evaluate the information. So as a patient or as a provider, you have to consider, is it isolate, full spectrum, whole plant? What's the dose? There's a biphasic dose response curve. A low dose has an opposite effect than high dose often. What's the route of administration? Edibles can be very different effect than inhaling. How long are you using? What's the condition? There's so many details to consider, and we all have to remember to critically evaluate that information. And it's just one example. I don't know if you heard about that CBD study. It came out a couple of years ago, and it said that CBD causes liver toxicity. And I hope the author of that study isn't here in the audience, because I'm sorry, I'm going to insult your study. It was the way the popular press grabbed this thing. They ran it with it and said CBD causes liver damage. Well, the study in mice gave over 100 times the maximal dose for CBD. And they said, in the 6 mice that over 100 times the maximal dose, 75% of them died. 75% of 6 mice is 4.5 mice. 4.5 mice died? I don't understand. And they isolated with hexane. It was not a good study, but the popular press grabbed it and ran with it. So it's very difficult to, try and evaluate and really read all the studies. But as much as we can, we educators, we healthcare professionals, we have to do that. We have to be vocal, we have to be proactive, we have to be accurate. So to summarize, maybe cannabis can help us change the nature of Western medicine, remind us to critically evaluate the data, help physicians to remember that every patient is unique and we should honor their experience, and help us inject a note of awe and wonder at the complexity and beauty of the human body, and encourage us all to relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. You're going to keep hanging out with us here for a little bit and come back
Yes, I'd
in
like
about
to. I will turn
20
my
minutes or so
video
for
off.
interactions with the audience and stuff like that. Okay. So wonderful. It's wonderful. We've heard from Josiah and his journey from hype to health and joy. We've heard from Dr. Rosenthal on changing the way we might think about Western medicine from one pill, one dose, one disease to a whole plant base. And now we have Ms. Amanda Barton, who is in the legal world in cannabis law. And we had a nice discussion here on those who have license to practice. What if they are using cannabis, and how might that affect their career and their livelihoods and these things? So turn it over to Amanda.
Hi, good morning, everybody. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today. This is an amazing conference. I love the ability to get up in front of people and help educate. That's the only way we're going to make progress in the cannabis industry. So thank you all for being here today. And it's going to be a hard act to follow, talking about policy, regulatory matters, and guideline differentials. But bear with me, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you all. So my name is Amanda Barton. I'm a partner with Mr. Cannabis Law. I've been an attorney in the state of Florida for over 11 years now. Before getting into the cannabis industry, I was in the alternative finance industry. It is as boring as it sounds. I really have always been passionate about cannabis. You can't deny some of the effects that you see that it has, especially with children with epilepsy. And just as we learn more and more about it, the value it could present to all of us, whether it be athletes, people struggling with mental health, and other people with health conditions. So in 2019, our firm was founded because there was a void. There was, states had been legalizing marijuana. There were big companies, starting operations. There was some really complex deals going down. And there no attorneys, none of the big firms would touch cannabis with the 10-foot pole. So our founder, Dustin Robinson, decided to start a firm that focused solely on the cannabis industry to provide good transactional business counsel at a high level to those companies in the cannabis industry. And that's kind of how our firm got started. I joined the firm a little bit over a year ago, but as I mentioned, I've been completely passionate about cannabis for a long time, since college. Now, it wouldn't be a lawyer presentation without a disclaimer. So the material provided here today is just for general information services. It should not be construed as legal advice. By me presenting today, this does not create an attorney-client relationship, and in some states, this material might be considered attorney advertising. Now, I'm going to take you back to grade school, and I don't mean to insult your intelligence here today, but I think it really is important to kind of revisit the framework of the United States Constitution and how our policies have been set up, because it really kind of explains how we got here. Why is everything so crazy and different in different states and across the nation? So in the U.S. Constitution, it specifically delegates certain powers to U.S. Congress. Now, under the Commerce Clause, that's what they deem to grant Congress the authority to regulate controlled substances. So the Controlled Substances Act has gotten its power through the Commerce Clause found in the US Constitution. Now, specifically, the Bill of Rights contains a reservation of powers clause, and it basically reserves powers not delegated to the federal government in the US Congress in the Constitution to the states or the people. So states can come up with their own regulations if it's not specifically regulated under the federal law. Furthermore, they can impose more stringent requirements over the federal law. Furthermore, you have counties, cities, municipalities, which also have regulations. In the cannabis context, we see this as certain counties not allowing for medical cannabis or not allowing for dispensaries. I live in the city of Boca Raton, doesn't allow medical cannabis facilities. Similarly, there's several counties in the state of Florida that do not allow dispensaries in their county. So this is an example how they can implement more stringent regulations. Then you also have down at the bottom kind of like private and public organizations, which can also impose their own regulations. Your employers, your private companies, your landlords, there's the lower level that can also impose regulations. So we have all these different types of government entities that can pose varying levels of regulations, and that's what really has created a nightmare when it comes to navigating the cannabis. Now, I was really into shapes when I was making this, so I do apologize for all the crazy shapes. Under federal regulation, it's pretty clear. As a lot of people have already mentioned, cannabis is prohibited and scheduled as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. That means it has no medicinal or medical value. I mean, I think everybody in this room can agree that that's just not the case. We really are hoping that, and there has been lots of efforts to try to deschedule medical marijuana so it can be researched, so it can be studied, so we can actually make progress in this industry. What the federal government has done is in 2018, December, they issued the 2018 Farm Bill, which effectively descheduled hemp. It took it out of the definition of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act. So according to the Farm Bill, hemp is considered marijuana that has 0.3% THC or less. So that's where CBD comes in. It can actually be created from marijuana, but most CBD is created from hemp, which makes it federally legal. That's why you can buy CBD online in one state and have it shipped to you. That's why it is allowed on airplanes. At this point, CBD and hemp products are federally legal, which is amazing. It gives everyone access to these substances. From that, there is also regulations from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that's governed by the FDA. So the FDA comes in that they govern food, drugs, and obviously cosmetics. But with the FDA, where we're seeing a lot of this is in the dietary supplements that are being created, the drinks that might have hemp, and so there's very, very tight regulations involving hemp under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Additionally, the DEA issued an interim final rule governing hemp, and there's also a USDA final rule talking about hemp. So I can have a whole presentation just on those bills alone, but basically that's all the regulations we currently, at a federal level, have specifically regarding hemp. Now, state regulations, they're all over the place. Some states it's illegal. Some states it's been decriminalized, but it's not technically legal to sell. Some states have medical programs. Some of those medical programs are horizontal, meaning like different companies can do different parts of the supply chain. Some companies can just grow, some can just sell, some can just process. There's also vertically integrated markets, such as Florida, where one company has to do everything from seed to sale. It's hard to be good at everything. So it's really difficult to excel here in Florida under our medical marijuana market due to the vertical integration. You also have other states that allow adult use, and this is your recreational states. So, why is it that states can have adult use? Well, basically, they've been forerunners, and they said, you know what, we're ignoring you, federal government. We're ignoring your Controlled Substances Act, And we believe there is value here, and we're going to legalize and allow marijuana in our state. So in the beginning, this was really controversial, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, what are the feds gonna do? So California was really the first one in 1996 to create the first medical marijuana program. After that, we saw Colorado and Washington come online in 2012, creating recreational markets. Then in 2016, surprisingly, Ohio created the first social equity framework, which was amazing. 2017, we see Florida voters pushed it through. Voters wanted it and pushed it through, and that's how we ended up with the vertically integrated market. And then today in 2022, you have 20 states that are adult use, and another 20 that allow medical marijuana. So nearly all the states have some form of marijuana allowed, which is absolutely amazing to see. Again, this is more, technically under federal law, it's still illegal, but these states have really kind of pioneered the way in cannabis. Now, why don't we see enforcement by the federal government? So under President Obama, there was Attorney General Cole came out with what's called the Cole Memorandum. And what the Cole Memorandum said is basically, we're not using federal resources and funding to go after companies that are operating legally under a framework that their state has approved and that are operating safely. I mean, the Department of Justice, what they're concerned about ultimately is safety, crime, and if a company is operating pursuant to a legal framework that was adopted by that state, they're not going to waste federal resources on that. They're looking to take down the cartels. They're looking to chase, other things. They don't want to use money to federally prosecute marijuana. Now, unfortunately, that memorandum was rescinded by Jeff Sessions, which we touched on today. And luckily, even though it was rescinded by Jeff Sessions, the DOJ kind of ignored it. They're still not really actively going after legally operating cannabis companies. They kind of just maintain the status quo as if the Cole Memorandum was still in effect. So, which is great for cannabis companies. There was a lot of concern when Jeff Sessions rolled back the Cole Memorandum, but luckily the DOJ just kind of ignored them. Now, drilling down to, so not only do athletes have to think about, okay, it's federally illegal, what's going on in my state, what's going on in my county, but they also have to consider the policies in their individual league or association. So most sports associations and leagues are structured as either nonprofit organizations, private associations, or private companies. So they can kind of choose what they want to do. They get to choose how they govern the teams and the athletes involved in the program. And that's why we have a lot of disparity between all the different associations and leagues. And yeah, even the rules and the testing standards can vary widely from one association to the next. So we have WADA. They were historically extremely anti-cannabis, but in 2013, they kind of relaxed their policy on cannabis, increasing the levels of THC metabolite allowed in urine before an athlete is considered to have failed a drug test or tested positive. It actually, this is a typo, is actually originally 50 ng per milligram, and they tripled it to 150 ng per milligram. And this is kind of consistent what you see with the rest of the agencies now, in leagues and associations. They specifically came out and announced in 2001 that CBD is allowed to be used in pro sports. It's no longer banned, which was incredible. That's wonderful. And hopefully we continue to see more progress with WADA. National Hockey League, NHL, they were one of the forerunners in 2016 to kind of announce that they're really not focusing so much on the penalties and the suspensions, but really focus more on educational assistance. They'll still test for it, but there's really no suspensions or punishments for positives. Rather, if a player has an abnormally high THC level, it's treated more like a health matter, a mental health matter, kind of more like alcoholism versus, oh, you're in trouble and you're going to be suspended. Now the MLB, we all need to cheer them on because in 2019 they became the first league to announce the removal of cannabis, specifically cannabinoids, from their list of banned substances, and that became effective in the 2020 season. So big shout out to MLB. We really appreciate you. Keep doing what you're doing. Hopefully they'll rub off on some of the other leagues. Next, we have the National Basketball Association, the NBA. In 2020, they were coming back from COVID. They restarted their session in Orlando, and they announced that random testing for marijuana would be suspended for the time. The suspensions continued. They continued them through the 2021-2022 season. And really, they're really focusing when they're testing on more of the performance-enhancing products and drugs of abuse. So, which is good. We're really kind of seeing a shift. NFL 2020, THC threshold for positive tests was also raised to 150 ng per milliliter. Also, what I found interesting is the testing window was reduced from, originally it was from 4 months to just the last 2 months of the training camps. So maybe players could enjoy a little in the off season. Additionally, they focus on assistance rather than suspension. So players are getting fined more for positive tests rather than not being allowed to play. It really shows a paradigm shift from viewing cannabis as a performance-enhancing drug to you can see the shift in their paradigm and how they're viewing cannabis, which is good. I think, like we've discussed and we'll continue to discuss through this conference, there really is no evidence to prove that, not truly a consensus that marijuana is an enhancing drug as far as performance. Well, as Josiah mentioned, it has great maybe effects on mental health. It helps with recovery, but as far as like truly enhancing performance, it's not similar to the other drugs in those categories, such as steroids or other things. Actually, I missed one. The NCAA, recently, actually just this year, they announced that they too are raising their threshold from 150 up to 150 ng per milligram, and they're also recommending less stringent penalties for positive tests, kind of reflecting what we're seeing in the other associations as well. So it's really interesting to see how this, it's only been the last couple of years that the professional sports leagues here in America have kind of changed their approach. And it's truly a shame, what we saw with Ms. Richardson getting disqualified from the Tokyo Summer Olympics. And I really do hope that they go back and take a look and, revisit the policies on cannabis in sports. And that's it for me. I appreciate you guys all so much. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we're going to go into Q&A. This is my contact information. If you guys ever have any legal questions, please feel free to reach out to me if you want to have a one-on-one discussion. I'm more than accessible if any of you have any questions.
Amanda, thank you so much. As Dr. Rosenthal and Jeff Conan will tell you that I'm a big fan of the history of cannabis in America, and you presented a really nice timeline, current timeline there, so that was nice too. So, open forum, discussion with the group. Do we have Dr. Rosenthal back online with us yet? She's here? Good. All right. Question up front.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentations. They're great. Fernando Manilak, Medical Director for Sports Medicine at Holy Cross in Fort Lauderdale. Just a quick question for Amanda. Working for a large federal company, Trinity owns us in Fort Lauderdale. I can't prescribe medical marijuana products. So I was wondering, usually I just refer out to the pain management specialist, and commonly every patient I send gets a medical marijuana card. So I was wondering, I know there's only certain diagnoses that get approved. Is there penalties being assessed for falsification? How are all these people?
That's a great question. Under the Florida statute, there is actually a list of qualifying conditions. PTSD, I believe, is on there. glaucoma, there's a whole litany, MS. But in addition, there's a catch-all that basically says any other indication that. Thank you. From the doctors. I'm sure you know that statute off the back of your hand. So yes, if it's similar a condition, then it can qualify under that. Now the doctor does have an obligation to look at the patient records and truly make sure that there is a reason to prescribe. And I can't speak for all doctors if that's being done. Hopefully the ones that take it very seriously will look into a patient's background to see if they qualify. If they are caught, if it becomes a systemic thing, I'm sure that discipline will happen, but there is a catch-all there.
All right, great. Thoughts? Okay.
No, go ahead, Barry, if you're going to.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, thank God for the similar, likewise, or as comparable clause in Florida. PTSD has a very broad definition, with PTSD being, and it's in my talk this afternoon, with PTSD being a part of Florida's program. Listen, we're all living in a world of PTSD. We're all coming out from behind the mask. We all know that it's narcotics and alcohol and depression and suicide and gun violence, all kinds of things killing Americans. So to me, turn off the cameras, please, I'm teasing. I'm not a policeman for the state. I'm an advocate for my patients, each and every one of them coming to me to want the same three things. And once again, prefacing my afternoon talk. Feel the best they can in the safest and most natural way they can, and to be legal in doing so. My job as an educator and a safety officer, that's what I do. It's what I do every day with honor and integrity. So the answer is, thank God for the wording of Florida's law.
Very good. The other hand up. You got a comment? Nope.
Yes, okay. Jeff Tinas with Summa Forte, and I apologize for people who were here yesterday because I asked a similar question, but we didn't have a lawyer on the panel. So I was talking to our lawyers back in Washington, D.C. So, Amanda, you talked about WADA and USADA and their willingness to maybe take a fresh look at THC and all the minor cannabinoids, by the way, that are not mentioned in their guidelines. They only prohibit THC and exempt cannabidiol. And you talked about the leagues and the various approaches that sport leagues are taking now. But at the end of the day, if you want to be embraced by an athletic organization, you need to pass through this monopoly gate called NSF and have NSFS certification. And so in WADA's current position and USADA's current position, they don't say that they would accept CBD, for example, that has below 0.3% THC. They just say no THC, right? And the sports leagues kind of follow that, right? And yet you have this NSF organization that will test products like this mix that we have that has no detectable THC in it, but because they don't like our transparency on our labeling where we also show a couple of minor cannabinoids, which are neither exempted nor prohibited, they asked us to say broad spectrum hemp instead of CBC and CBG, which we refuse to do. Then they go on a search and destroy mission and they test us down to such a nano level that they now claim we have 1/500th of 0.3%, so they cannot certify and give us NSFS certification, even though 3 other independent labs found no THC, even going deeper than NSF did. So we're in the middle of dealing with this, but I would like your legal opinion on, how do all of these kind of macro organizational changes really matter when at the end of the day, the athletic institutions and leagues want an insurance policy, which today is only coming from NSF, in order to actually recommend something to players. Otherwise, it's caveat emptor. You could do what you want, but don't come back to us if you test over 0.3%.
I mean, that's a doozy, to be honest. I don't think there's the proper answer to that question. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. You know, as I was thinking about adding a whole bunch of the minor cannabinoids into my presentation, but I was afraid it was going to make it way too long. You know, we are seeing, you know, minor cannabinoids becoming very popular on the market, just, you know, recreationally. And it's posing a problem because the state governments don't react quickly. They don't know. They don't, you know, have scientists and doctors on staff. And I think the same is true of these organizations, right? Like, it all comes down to education, and they're afraid of what they don't know. So I think a lot of it has to do with education, unfortunately. And it is a private organization, so you can't force them to change their position on it, unfortunately. I mean, luckily in the state of Florida, the Florida Department of Agriculture has been very open to talking about minor cannabinoids and working with us and working through the different products as they come available, and you know, being honest about whether or not they think they're proper or not. You know, there's a fine line with what is a synthetic cannabinoid and what is natural. Is it natural just because it's naturally occurring in the plant, even though you have to produce it going through a huge scientific process in a laboratory? So I think it's, you know, it's a gray area, and it's just going to take time and research and education to get them to change their ways. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I just don't, that's a doozy. I just don't think there is one, unfortunately.
Go ahead and grab the mic real quick and just hang out over there and hand it right back to her.
Okay, this will be short. I'm sorry, but I'm looking for sympathy. Okay,
got my
you know where you
sympathy.
can find that in the dictionary, right?
Because it's really interesting. You know, over and over, I keep writing down education, transparency. This is coming up in every panel so far, and it's so true. And I want to be a part of that. We launched this brand to be science-driven, high quality, and build trust. And I tell people our target consumers are entities and individuals who don't yet use CBD. So potential investors kind of look at me crosswise, like, wait a minute, but aren't you CBD? I said, yes, but there's a sea of potential out there of those who don't want to risk their reputation because they can't trust brands. So that being said, you know, everybody talks about the importance of having your COA on a QR code. So we do that, of course, in independent labs, and we test throughout the supply chain, not just the final COA, all right? NSF will not share their analysis with us even. They tell us that we fail at the nano level, and we say, show us your analysis, and they won't show us the analysis. Really? So, you know, I just want people to know that, you know, that's what's happening at the NSF level. I want to call them out here.
So as we're transitioning the mic back there, when I took Dr. Rosenthal's courses, you know, they brought up that 0.3% threshold, if you will. Completely arbitrary number mentioned as an arbitrary point in a study from 1968. And the individual who published the study, I went back and found the original article, specifically said, for this study, we're calling hemp arbitrarily 0.3% or less THC. And yet, that arbitrary number decided by one researcher in 1960s is in regulation everywhere. And I question our regulators, I question our scientists. I'm like, where is the logic in this?
If you actually go outside the United States, the threshold is much higher. It's actually 1% or less. So United States is significantly lower than the average threshold on a worldwide basis.
So with that point, we'll just keep that in mind. Just let that bounce around for a little bit. Good, go ahead. Oh, mic on.
It's working now, maybe?
Yeah, there
okay,
you go.
so great. I work for a professional baseball organization, and I deal with NSF supplementation quite often. And I saw your slide that you mentioned that there is more regulation from the FDA and the Cosmetic Drug Act with cannabis. So I was wondering if you could just allude to more of that regulation, because I understand as a registered dietitian and athletic trainer why MLB has that NSF for sport policy for our supplementation policies and tracking through the safety and efficacy of supplements. But I haven't necessarily been well versed in how it would affect cannabis. I see as this man's product line is labeled as a supplement facts on the back, so I'm assuming that's why we have to have that certification. But if you had any more information on what the FDA specifically is doing in the regulation of a cannabinoid product.
So a lot of it comes down to if there is a drug on the market that has FDA approval. So hemp has Epidiolex, and there's a synthetic THC that came out a long time ago. The name of it escapes me. Marinol, thank you. And that's a synthetic THC, and because they are FDA-approved drugs, you cannot use the same substance in a food or a drink. So that's why a lot of them are labeled as dietary supplements, and even you have to be very careful with that. I'm not an FDA regulatory attorney, so I'm sure it goes into much more detail than that, and we could get in a whole discussion. But basically, it comes down to some of the problem is because that there is drugs that are already FDA approved out there on the market.
Those drugs that are approved would not be able to be in some of the exhibitor products because they're classified separately.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
So I've got a question for all three of our presenters here. And Dr. Rosenthal mentioned the catch-22. And Josiah mentioned Angela Bryan doing research with runners who had used cannabis prior to coming in, which to me is a what I call a natural environment study versus a controlled environment study, which I think is just fine. But then, so how do we get past this catch-22, this big, super thick glass wall that everybody can see beyond but can't get through? And then and then Amanda mentioned the attitudes are changing. And so, again, for all three of you, how do we get past this catch-22? Athletes are using it. And sports organizations are beginning to change their paradigm. There's paradigm shifts. So I'll just shut up and let you all talk about that.
Yeah, I can touch on that. The study that I showed the pictures of with me running on the treadmill, we had to go through a very convoluted process to consume cannabis in a university study. They couldn't give it to me on campus because that would threaten a lot of their federal funding. There are channels through the DEA where you can get cannabis through the University of Mississippi. I believe their threshold is something like 6 or 9% THC for what they can grow. Most things on the market, at least in Colorado, are 17 to 23% THC. They have no CBD products. The things that they send researchers are these either cans of cigarettes, marijuana cigarettes, or it's a freeze-dried cannabis that needs a special rehydrator that they would then use for their research. And Angela Bryan and her husband, who's also a researcher, had used this in the past, and people in Boulder were like, this is terrible. I would never consume this. And as researchers, they're thinking, well, this isn't reflective of what people are using out in the world, so our research isn't applicable. So when they did it with me, they had me go to a dispensary. They contacted the dispensary saying, give him this type of flower, but I had to go get it myself. I had to go to a friend's house, and there was a van waiting outside. They took my blood in the van, and then I go into my friend's house, and I consume the cannabis, and I come back out to the van where they take more blood, and they rush me over to the campus where I'm running on a treadmill with a mask on. It was during COVID, and that was the best that they could do to research cannabis. So there's a tremendous amount of barriers. That's actually much easier if you want to study cocaine or heroin. You can actually administer that in the university campus because those are Schedule II substances. Do I have that wrong? They are.
Yeah, I just
Okay.
That process there and how they.
Right. I think
Heroin Schedule 1. Cocaine Schedule 2, heroin's 1.
Okay, yeah. Okay, but opioids, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, I believe. Isn't that right? Okay. Providing you with all sorts of inaccurate information today. But basically, research around cannabis is more difficult than most other substances. And so I think before we can change laws, before that catch-22 can be unpacked, we really need more reliable, consistent research, and we need to break down the barriers and even provide funding for a lot of this university research.
Dr. Rosenthal, thoughts?
Oh, I keep thinking it's so obvious that this should happen, but for the last few years, there's a lot of things that I think that so obviously government should do, and it's not happening. So I don't know if we're just going to reach a tipping point. 1/3 of Americans live in a state now where cannabis adult use is legal. Is there a tipping point where there's just going to be, okay, it's obvious this should at least be rescheduled and to be Schedule 3, if anything, because Schedule 2 can be difficult to do research still, although much easier than Schedule 1. So I don't know the answer, but it's so frustrating because we know that there is a lot of data that suggests it is safe and effective, but keeping it as a Schedule 1 drug, I just don't understand, and I don't know when it's going to be fixed.
Very good. So as we be respectful of the time, we're coming up on the lunch hour. One more thought right there.
Good morning, George Gadzik with Ash Creek Financial. I'm attempting to play the role of problem solver and connector here. I'm hearing this gentleman say, they've submitted their product for testing to the NFC, but they won't give them results. Amanda, this is for you. Is that something an attorney representing this gentleman could get involved with and compel the NFC to release that information?
That's a great question. I'd have to look into their specific policies. I definitely think you could put pressure. A lawyer could get involved and put pressure. I don't know if you could actually compel them to turn it over. You can make a compelling case for it, absolutely, and it might help to get an attorney involved to really put pressure and to open the issue up. But I don't know if they actually are required to provide it because they are a private it's not a public or governmental entity. So, but that's a great question. I'd love to look into it further and see if I can offer some more guidance. I just don't know off the top of my head.
And it seems like the changes are coming from the ground up, from the people up. Kevin mentioned earlier that a contingent of Jeff and his group went to the NC2A and talked about increasing the threshold. You talked about all the number of sports organizations changing their thresholds, changing the way they look at it, and I think that came from a lot of players' unions and from the ground up there as well too. So I see a grassroots effort, and I think it's beginning to be strong, and I think keeping those going and having these discussions in public and openly will eventually lead us into a spot of maybe better enlightenment, if you will. So with that, we'll thank the speakers for sharing their time with us, and we'll head on out. So thank you.
One quick announcement. Lunch will be served in Ballroom A, which as you exit,
Recording
go
stopped.
to the right all the way before the hotel restaurant.